Hello and welcome to this live and interactive web stream. I'm Kevin Harris. Recent research shows that millions of us avoid discussing unpleasant money issues with our partner, such as what we owe on credit cards and overspending on joint accounts. The research shows that money is the leading cause of arguments between couples. So, as the post-Christmas bills start to come in, how much damage can be done to our relationships? How do we spot the telltale signs, and what are we even liable for? Well, I'm pleased to say, here to discuss the answers to these questions and more, we're joined today by Anastasia Duval from Family Lives, Caroline Watson from Slater Gordon, and Paul Crayston from the National Debt-Line. So guys, thank you for coming in.
Afternoon.
Now, don't forget, of course, we are live today, so if you do have any questions for any of our panel throughout the time that we are on air, you can send your questions via the box that's on your screen right now. And if you're tweeting whilst watching the show, use that all-important hashtag, that is hashtag StudioTalkTV, and we'll do our best to give you a mention. So, Caroline, it was Slater Gordon, your company, that commissioned this research. What were some of the findings that you found out?
The research found that up to a fifth of those surveyed didn't understand or know the law in relation to joint debts or the credit card position, and millions of Brits admitted to not disclosing to their other half details of debts. So perhaps spending on credit cards and not admitting it, or taking out loans and not admitting it.
And you think that's quite, do you think that perhaps is quite uncommon within a relationship, that they could get themselves in that situation where one partner knows one side of the story and the other person doesn't know any of it?
Actually, we're finding more and more that it's actually more and more common to find that people are hiding debts these days and able to take out credit cards without actually disclosing that information to their partner. So no, we actually find it's more and more common. Yeah,
and Anastasia, you work for Family Lives. We were just chatting. It's a parenting charity, parenting helpline charity predominantly. But did these results, surprise you in any way? Is this something you've heard of before?
It is, sadly, it is something we've heard of. I mean, one of the very common reasons that people ring is it's a parenting helpline, for example, parent line, but actually often the issue is around money problems generally. One of the reasons we're hearing far more of these problems is because people are in a more difficult financial situation. And interestingly and depressingly as well, one thing that people feel very uncomfortable about is talking about their money problems. I think there's a sense of shame about it often. You failed. How did you get into a situation you consider yourself to be responsible? As more people are suffering financial difficulties, this is likely to be something that comes up more and more in partnerships. We need to talk about it more, and I think that the only consolation that more people are having problems is more people are having difficulties. More people can therefore feel that they're in the same boat and hopefully feel less ashamed about talking about it.
Yeah, so I mean, in the current climate, you would say this is something that you've perhaps seen an increase of.
Yeah.
It's less.
Definitely. I mean, more people are losing their jobs. That's just one example. Therefore, they've got spending which needs to carry on. It's not always about this kind of idea that suddenly you've gone out on a spending spree and gone to designer shops. Yeah. Sadly, today it's very much a reality about just making ends meet. Very basic things. Sometimes it's about being responsible with your spending, but actually not being able to make things as they should be financially with the little money that you've got. What we're also seeing is that because quite often there are separate incomes perhaps coming in for two, as it were, for both sides of the partnership, there hasn't necessarily been a need to talk about financial issues because there haven't been any difficulties. Perhaps there's been a little bit of keeping yourself to yourself financially. When there are difficulties, then suddenly it's a new conversation that you haven't actually had before. That's a new issue when you've got less money.
That's very interesting. And Paul, you work for the National Debt-Line. What advice would you have straight off the bat for couples or families that find themselves in situations like we've just heard of there?
Get advice. Free impartial advice is available. You can go to your local Citizens Advice Bureau and get face-to-face advice. You can use free phone helplines such as the National Debt-Line. Go online. National Debt-Line has a website. There are loads of tools available online. Actually getting that advice is a real first step to recovery. And know that advice really works. It makes a massive difference. And one of the things that we always sort of encourage people to do is try and work out ways that they can increase their income. Yeah. Sometimes people think, how am I going to be able to increase my income? It's just not possible. Yeah. The reality is that more than £15 billion of benefits and tax credits goes unclaimed every single year.
And that's just one sort of avenue to look down, I'm sure, when they phone up and get advice. There's lots of other ways that you can look to increase your income.
That's right. It's actually step one of a four-step process that we go through. Cool. So then we talk about doing a sort of thorough income and expenditure sheet, so a budget basically, that you can stick to, and then deal with different types of debt.
Great stuff. All right, well, we'll be coming back to you guys in a moment or two. But let's take an opportunity now then to hear a case study from Lisa, who found herself in a relationship in debt problems a little like this.
I discovered my husband's secret spending when I got home early one day. I was a mobile hairdresser, So I just happened to call him for lunch, and he was on the sofa on the telephone, and as I walked in, he put the phone down and looked really guilty. And when I questioned him, he was like, nothing, there's nothing wrong. And there was a pile of papers next to him. When I picked them up, it was a court order for us to be in court that day because we was about to have the house repossessed. We split up, and after about 6 months, he went to live in America. So it was, the first 6 months was just confusing, and by the time I'd come out of that, he'd moved away. I trusted him. You know, he was my husband. I cared about him and loved him. And, you know, it's a shame to have been let down, but that's the past, and I've just got to get on with it.
So there you go, sad times for Lisa, but it's a story that is not uncommon. Now, obviously, in Lisa's situation there, Anastasia, her relationship broke down and she actually parted company with her other half. But let's perhaps start at the beginning with this one. If you are starting out in a relationship, obviously you come from a family life, a parenting organisation, what sort of things should you bear in mind when you're starting a relationship, perhaps in later life as well, where you've both got jobs and responsibilities already, you know, to ensure that you've both got a kind of an understanding of your financial responsibilities in that relationship or within that family?
I think one of the things that's changed a lot, which is a very positive thing in lots of ways, more ways than negative actually, is the fact that we tend to have, particularly when we start a relationship as young people, we have separate finances in the sense that we've both got incomes. Obviously in 1950s, 1940s, that wasn't the case. The good thing about that is it means we can have some independence within our own incomes, but also what tends to happen then is we have a shared income, perhaps when we get a mortgage, when we live together, income in terms of household expenditure, etc. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's important that people don't feel if they're not disclosing everything in terms of their money as opposed to the information about it, it's somehow a problem. The difficulty really comes down to something which affects relationships in every aspect, and that's about openness and honesty. If you're having a problem, doesn't matter what area it's in, and you feel very worried about it, but you're not talking about it with your other half, that's an issue. It doesn't matter what the issue is in itself, if it's work, if it's something to do with your relationship, or if in this case it's money. If you're hiding it, that's why you're having a relationship problem with it. And that really is the bottom line. The bottom line needs to be that you don't have to share all your money, but if you're worried about an aspect of it, or if you're spending in a different way from the way that you're presenting it to your other half, that needs to come out. And what we were hearing from Lisa's story is very much about the fact that her other half didn't disclose the problems that he was having, and it came as a complete surprise. And that is really the problem. What we're going to find often, and what we've certainly heard in terms of case studies, is that when a couple talk about one of the other half's problems, it doesn't tend to lead to disaster if they talk about it at the beginning of their problem, or if they talk about it eventually even. It's the fact that they don't talk about it, that it comes to a head without having discussed it, that tends to lead to disaster. Your partner is likely not to judge you in terms of the difficulties. It's about sharing your problem, and that's what good relationships are about.
Yeah, interesting. And Paul, I was just to say to you that you probably get calls from all kinds of people, but I mean, in the first instance, are there any telltale signs within a couple or relationship that something might not be quite right? I mean, do you get calls from one half of a couple saying, I think something's
we get enough
wrong?
calls that we cover the whole spectrum. We have sort of cases where we're authorised to speak to a couple of people, and it's not just sort of husband and wife, it's sometimes mother and daughter or something like that. But we also have cases where the reverse is true, and it's, well, if we have to call you back for something, are we allowed to say that we're calling from National Debt Line?
Absolutely,
and there's literally on our system a tick box of yes or no. So there's some people who just don't want to share those pieces of information. Sometimes because they may be keeping it from a partner, sometimes because they don't want to let their children know and worry them, which is of course very much understandable. So there is a whole gambit of responses to this kind of problem. And some people, I think generally with a debt problem, will just face up to it and will be very proactive and try and manage it. And the earlier they do that, they tend to get a better outcome. But like you say, there are those people who will avoid the problem, ostrich scenario, bury their head in the sand. By the time they pull their head back out of the sand, things are very serious.
And often they're not admitting it to themselves, let alone talking about it.
That's exactly right.
And Caroline, just talking about people's kind of like legal responsibilities, do you think, you know, couples and people in relationships are even aware of what they're liable for? I mean, perhaps if a couple are married, then both names are on the mortgage deeds or the house deeds, that's pretty obvious. But
No,
the
it's very
situations where
clear from our
people-
research that people are not aware at all of their responsibilities, and it does change between people being married and unmarried couples as to their liabilities and responsibilities. But people do tend to think, well, if I'm signing up to a joint loan, then that means I'm just signing up for half of it, and actually worse still, think I'm only signing up for my responsibility of what I spend on it. So if they go and spend 10,000 of that 20,000 loan, well, we're only 10,000. And actually that's not the case. When you sign a credit agreement, you're actually signing up to saying, I will be responsible for the whole amount of this.
Right.
So you're what we call jointly and severably liable. And what that means is to the credit agency is we will seek repayment from whoever we think is going to be more available to pay us back our money. So yes, there's certainly a misconception that people think I'm only signing up for a small amount of that loan, and that's not the case at all.
No.
And for married couples, you don't actually have to be the person to sign up for the loan. In a divorce, you can ultimately become responsible for a debt because simply if your other half can't afford to carry on that debt and you've got assets,
Really?
a debt has to be paid ultimately. So it comes into a divorce settlement, and it can be very expensive and very time consuming to actually work out when that debt came into existence and who should be responsible. But ultimately, you don't actually have to be named on a debt to end up taking away some of that debt on a divorce settlement.
Gosh, that's quite interesting. I'm sure, like you said, there's probably many people are, oblivious to that fact. We've got some questions coming in. Thank you for those of you that have been sending them. Like I said, you've got the box on the screen, and if you're tweeting, just add hashtag Studio Talk TV. We've got one coming here. It's from Jan. She says, things are going really well with my new boyfriend, but he has said a few odd things about his credit cards. How do I find out if there are problems? It's so awkward to mention it. Well, that's quite an interesting one, isn't it, really? And feel free to jump in. How do you go about mentioning that?
I mean, it probably more for Anastasia, but my response to something like that would be, largely depends how far into a relationship you are. I mean, if it's a second date in a bar and you're quizzing the chap on his credit card debts, then that's going to cause a bit of a problem, a bit of friction. But if it's a more serious relationship and the sort of concept of it being a new boyfriend is a bit more stretched, then it might be time to, like you say, have those conversations early, get to know exactly where you are so that you understand each other and where you're coming from.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the point where it becomes where you're sharing your finances, it's absolutely fundamental that you talk about it. If you're in a relationship where perhaps you don't live together, you're not sharing any finances, it's likely that if it seems that there's a problem, that it might be something you want to gently ask them about, because quite often people really want to talk about the problem, but they need to be given the opportunity to. So it's good to play it by ear. I do think it matters how intimate you are in the sense of how well you know each other. I mean, are there other issues that you haven't addressed? Perhaps credit card bills isn't the first one too. But I think it is really good to try and get a feel for whether this is something that actually your other half really would like to talk about, because you may be doing them a huge favour.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, Jan, that, as the guys say, depending on where you are in that relationship, if you're considering going on the road of moving in with somebody, then you've got to get these things
absolutely. If they go to the
next
next stage of moving in together, then there's always they can go into what we call a living together agreement, which sets out their financial situation. And again, if a couple are actually married, then there is still the remedy of what we call a post-nuptial agreement to set out responsibility for debt. So if people discover whilst still married together and but they just want to set out the responsibility, then it's not too late to do it.
Great. Okay, lovely. Thanks, Jan. We hope that helps you. Kelly has sent a question in. She says, my husband has started a business and I don't want to be financially linked to him in case the business goes under and they come after the house and my money. Is that okay? How can I get him to understand? Karen, probably one for you there, I would imagine.
It's what people can do is their own credit rating check, and against their own credit rating check, they will do a check against anyone they're associated with. So as a starting point, it's always advisable for people to do that. And there are 3 agencies that you can apply to quite easily to do that. They're Equinox, the Credit Check, and Experian, and it's very simple to do, and you will then get a history of someone's credit rating. So if there are any previous issues, they will be flagged up, and then the best advice to her is to go and speak to a lawyer or an accountant to get some advice on how the company's being set up, because it comes down to the type of company they're setting up as to who will be responsible for any company debts.
Yeah, that's really important. Another quick thing to say on that is that whenever you are setting up a business, be it a partner doing it or whatever, it's important to make sure you always separate business finances from personal finances. You don't want to be funding your own business with personal credit lines. Things get really, really tangled in that way, and the liabilities are slightly different. So if you are funding a business, look for business credit rather than personal credit products.
Okay.
And just to add on a relationship level, I think it's important to say that you're worried about it. You're worried about this impacting on the personal life that you share together. Perhaps that you're worried about if it feels like a gamble that your other half is taking. I think it is important that you voice those concerns, because if difficulties arise later and you say, I told you so, that's not going to feel as supportive. I know it sounds critical perhaps to voice concerns, but I think it's actually more helpful to voice them at the beginning, because maybe that will make you be able to sit down with your other half and talk about some of the things that you're concerned about.
Yeah, definitely. And Paul, just when people have kind of found themselves perhaps in, their money matters have gone awry. You've said quite rightly that there is help out there. What are some of the practical steps, if I was to phone up the National Debt Line or an advice service, what are some of the practical steps that I can actually do to start to get my finances under control?
The first thing we would suggest that someone does, which I mentioned earlier, is go through someone's income. Can they get more money? And it's not just benefits and tax credits, but that's part of it. The next thing to do, get down all of your income, all of your expenditure, put it in one place. You can see how much you've got coming in, how much you've got going out. Is there a surplus there that you can use to pay down debt? And the nature of that budget will determine what options are available. Now that could be something more serious like insolvency. There are various insolvency regimes that you can follow, or it could be just a simple case of, I've got £30 left over a month to pay towards my debt. I need to contact my 3 or 4 creditors to let them know what share I'm going to be offering them. So there's various different options, but once you've sought advice, we can sort of talk you through all of that.
Yeah, good stuff. And Anastasia, just kind of touched on it briefly there, but top tips for avoiding financial problems within relationships or within families. I mean, is there anything else?
I think the main thing, it applies, as I said, to any aspect of your life. If you're in an intimate relationship, particularly if you've got to the point where you really are sharing things, or that the idea is that you're sharing things, then it's important that you cover all of these bases. Financial matters is just one of them. It's an important issue. It's something which today is going to be perhaps different for a lot of people than it was even 5 years ago. Really important to feel that you can talk about money problems, and also to give that safe space to feel that it's okay to discuss problems, but also to think about planning for the future. That's going to be a huge important part of people's relationships. What money they put aside perhaps for nice things. It's not just going to be about problems. If you have money as a conversation on the table, I think that's really going to help talking about money difficulties. If money is something you've never talked about, it's going to be harder. Every relationship expert says at the beginning of a relationship which has become serious, talk about money. It's helpful. It may seem absolutely inappropriate. It tends to be actually far more inappropriate not to ever broach the subject.
And to try and broach it further down the line, for sure.
Exactly.
Maria, you've just sent a question in via the box on the screen. Thanks ever so much. She has said, I think my husband has forged my signature to access finances in our account. How can I deal with that legally? Caroline, I think, probably have a go at that one.
She would need to, again, get specialist legal advice on that. But actually that's a criminal offence to actually forge anyone's signature. So it is very serious. And I'd recommend she gets further legal advice.
There you go. We hope that helps you, Maria. And Caroline, just to kind of wrap up, because we are almost out of time, from a legal point of view, what kind of advice would you offer for couples and families who find themselves in these situations?
I think it's very similar to the practical advice that Anastasia has been given. We would always say to people, communicate, because things generally get worse, and the sooner, if you have got a debt problem, the sooner you own up, the sooner you can help try and work through it before it gets to a stage where you're actually talking separation. And usually it's better to own up than your partner to find out, because my experience is that leads people to my door for a divorce rather than actually trying to work through a problem together.
Exactly.
And as we've heard today, there is help, so it's worth getting it.
Great stuff. Guys, thank you ever so much for coming in. We are out of time. And thanks to you, as always, for watching. Big thanks then to Anastasia, Caroline and Paul for joining us. Now, don't forget, if you would like to find out more information about anything that you've heard about here today while you're watching along, or just get some advice in general, then log on to www.slatergordon.co.uk. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.